Chapter 1. The cult that cannot doubt out enough. Relate out musinling. And in one term of self and money when you study. The lost light at night and not ruined. Stands to your endurance bedroom and slide under a thick duvet on a mattress I used after off the cold floor in a room whose walls are insulated, whose windows are double glazed, whose radiator has been quietly being a squeeze for hours. For hours. Now imagine all of that stripped away. No insulation in the walls. No walls. Glazed windows. No windows. No windows at all. Or windows covered only by oiled cloth or wooden shutters that admit the cold freely, while including the light. A floor of packed earth that conducts the cold from the groundward is the of wall and daub, or a rough stone that transmit the outside temperature into the interior with a delay of only hours. Paths. This is the sleeping environment of the medieval peasant. And this is They survived it. The winters of the Middle Ages were not all modern winter. They were often colder in specific periods. And were always faced by a population. The isolations forceful for dealing with cold than any person in the modern developed world as a matter of course. The period roughly from 300 to 300 to 1800 to Easted is known to climatologists as the Little Ice Age. A period of generally lower temperatures across the northern hemisphere, punctuated by episodes of exceptional cold that produced the historical memory. The Thames froze solid enough. Fast fairs. The Baltic Sea over repeatedly. Alpine glaciers and depositions. They have not occupied since. And in the villages of medieval, the peasants instituted vast brutality, face and lost his nurtures instead with resources that we would today, wholly inadequate. But here is the story of something than of suffering. They survived, not all of them. Winter, it was season of elevated mortality, particularly, and the old, the death record, and the truths that I from medieval with the filter shot as in pensions in the coldest months, but the majority survived year after year, generation after generation after generation, and they so by buying the cold, by of strategies, architectural, social, behavioral, and technological in the medieval sense of that word, that were far more sophisticated than their material simplicity suggest. This is the story of those strategies. The medieval peasant, who are we talking about? Before we can understand how medieval pets are, we napped in winter. We need a clear picture. We need to of who actually we the word peasant covers an enormous range of conditions. And the relative Roland, who his land and could afford some proper hearth with a proper hearth. To the landless laborer who slept on a pile of straw, someone else simply have and have. To have roof. Most medieval peasants, somewhere between these extremes, but that's the living event. The press majority were dramatically different from we today would consider comfort. The typical English peasant dwelling of the high medieval period, roughly the 12th through 14th centuries, was a longhouse. A single longhouse, a single rectangular structure shared by the human family at one end and their livestock at the other, divided by a partition, the partition that was more symbolic than thermally significant. The walls were of wattle and daub and bramf of plastermeister, a mixture of clay and animal dung, or in some regions of rough stone laid out without mortar or with weak lime mortar. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds. The floor was earthen, sometimes hardened, but not with lime, but there were thick windows, was covered with oiled cloth. The fireplace in the earliest period was a has a whore was sort of both to allow escape allow out soul to escape. A hole that also allowed cold rain and wind to enter freely. This basic structure persisted with banal variations. In Scandinavia, where Scandinavia, the winters were dispersed and the timber abundant, peasant structures tended to be more robustly built, wetter joints. In southern France and Spain, the milder climate permitted in the mountain regions, and in the mountain regions of Europe, the longhouse tradition stayed, it's really clear. I'm fine for if that reduced heat loss, but across most of basically was the same. A thin walled with shared by the entire family and frequently by their animals as well. Chapter Hearth Earth of the foundation of a winter survivor, the central fire, the hearth, was not simply a semblance in the medieval peasant home. It was physical, social, symbolic center of the household's entire existence. Everything that happened at home happened in cooking and eating, working and talking, the gathering of the family, the end of the day, tending of the sick, the performance of the rituals that marked the passage of the seasons and the family life. To understand how medieval peasants survived winter night, and understand as it was sent man to be as good and could not do, and how timing and management of the fire shaped the conditions under which the family slept. The central hearth of the early medieval longhouse was a remarkable standards. On the floor of the building, it radiated heat in all directions, including upward, where much of the heat meted the roof and escaped. It produced substantial quantities of smoke. It really worth or throw the roof for clear of the structure. and which in the meantime filled the upper of the interior space with a space that was without the racism. That were endemic in medieval population. The heat it produced was intense immediately beside the fire. Diminished sharply. The fawn of a young house might be only marginal born, but when the fire was burning well, by the high medieval period, the 12th and 13th centuries. The open Senfirth being Sadrule's agent was a more prosperous households but wall fireplace with a chimney. This is a technological improvement of considerable significance. The chimney drew the smoke out of the room much more efficiently than the roof hole, dramatically improved air quality, improving and not headlines. The wall fireplace also reflected heat more of the somewhat, but the chimney also told the air into the warm air expelled and of peasant households. The open central hearth remained the most of the medieval period. Banking the fire, the art of overnight heat, the management of the domestic fire through the night was one of the most important practical households and the medieval household and the specific banking the fire. It deserves careful attention because it was the primary mechanism by which a degree of warmth came into dwelling through the sleeping hours. Banking a fire means covering the embers or ash or with a thick layer of peat, typically peat, in areas where peat was available, or charcoal, or packed wood. But in a way, the combustion dramatically preserving the heat of an actively burning fire. A well-banked fire continues through the night. Light and relatively little active heat, but maintaining glowing embers by fluid the buildings of fresh fuel The embers of a banked fire retain sufficient to reignite easily for many hours. Some of them through the entire night and into the following morning. The warmth produced this smoldering fire was modest but real. But prevented the entire dropping of the cold, particularly in the immediate vicinity of the hearth. The importance of maintaining the fire through the night was not merely practical, but deeply cultural. The fire that went out overnight was a failure of household management with both immediate consoles, old lit house. A cold, unlit house in months in that had to be started from scratch. Time-consuming process that required preserved embers, flint and steel, or assistance from a native, and symbolic significance. In many medieval cultures, the domestic fires that understood as a spirit, of a spirit, or a divine gift whose continuity represented itself. The fire that was allowed to go out was an ill omen, and the responding feeling it as thermal management. Peat, turf, and fuel burned in the medieval hearth. The fuel available to medieval peasants for their fires varied enormously by region and period, and the quality and availability of fuel was what really needed for a fuel of that could actually be. In the upland regions of Britain and Ireland, peat was primarily domestic primaries from most cutting blocks cut in from the bog, dried over the summer and stored for winter use in quantities that a family with access to good peat land could have productive months. Through the productive months, peat slowly produces not peat. Banking technique in lowland and forested regions. Wood was the primary fuel. As for winter that's determined a peasant's winter survival. the rights to gather wood from the Lord's forest. The right of estovers in English law were among a most jealously guarded of the common rights that peasants depended upon, and disputes over wood gathering rights fill the rights. Occurred's medieval manners, a family with good access to firewood could maintain a reasonably warm home through even the harshest winters. As was was very restricted by the lordship of his forest with his danger. Faced genuine danger. Coal was used as a domestic in certain regions of medieval England. Where outcrop near the surface had been known since the Roman period. And in parts of the Rhineland and the Low Countries, but for most of medieval Europe, coal remained peat and dried animal dung, which burns characteristic smell, but produces a slow, persistent heat that is effective for overnight banking. The management of the fuel supply through winter, of the occupation of the naval household, and the transition from autumn to winter was marked by the field activities that would determine how warm or cold Chapter 3. The bed architecture of warmth. Where you slept mattered as what you wore in the modern world, and that will be warmth in sleep primath, a term primarily in terms of bedded or bibbing. Duvet or blankets that cover us, but for the medieval peasant, the question of warm when sleep of question of section where in the structure one slept, how far from ground, how far heat of the banked fire, how well protected from the drafts that moved through the building through every gap in the walls. The positioning of the sleeping area within the medieval was a matter of much convention. Simple architectural choice affecting her sleeping comfort was the height of sleeping serpent off the ground. Cold air is denser than warm air, sinks to the floor level. The temperature at floor level in a medieval building on a cold winter night led to raise light degrees lower than the temperature at waster or above. A sleeping person lying directly on the earth and coldest out of the build. Losing heat rapidly, both through the direct conduction to the earth. Even saints. Mayonnaise, several desserts, reasons throughout the year, acting as a constant heat sink, and through the cold air that pooled at floor level, raising the sleep-beeping surface even a foot above the floor, made a meaningful difference. The medieval box bed, known in various forms across northern and western Europe, appearing in Scotland as the balla, in Scandinavia as the enclosed bed in the Low Countries, and northern France as the bedstead or lit close. Of the close was one of the most ingenious responses among some medieval. The box bed was essentially a sleepwalker. Squares, 4 panels, a door or curtain at the front. Built into the structure of the portier. Into the architecture. When the occupant was inside, when closed, the door of efficiency, creating a microclimate with the sleeping space that room, then the surrounding room. The anatomy of the medieval bed for the majority of the medieval peasants who did not have the resources of sleeping box bed. The sleep was the same incident and as activated methods. Permitted. The bed of a moderately prosperous medieval peasant would typically a wooden frame or a wooden platform raised ground covered by a sack of straw, or that served as the mattress. Straw is an excellent insulator. It perhaps there within its structure compatibility fill with modern fiberfill materials. A fresh straw maps was was a significantly warmer sleeping surface than the Oneida. Of lying on the ground, and the regular renewal of the straw, typically annually, often at harvest time when fresh straw was most available, maintained its thermal properties above the straw mattress. The bedding consisted of household. The household possessed. Wool is the medieval world's most effective insulating fiber. It retains its insulating properties even when damp. It is naturally resistant to fire. And unprocessed wool aids a degree of water resistance that is genuinely invaluable in the damp cold of a northern European winter. The number and quality and poids of wool blankets was a direct editor. Through the winter night, a wealthy peasant might have 2 or 3 substantial wool blankets. Poor one might have a single worn cover warrant over the sleeping body. At the uppermost level of the bed, cut close the sleeping space from above. Typically some form of counterpane or bed cover in the most prosperous households. This movie wool or with the down of waterfowl. The goose down duvet. The more that it is duvet, and the more prosperous burgesses for the average peasant, the top was more likely to be a woven blanket. A piece of felt wool, or even at breast, an animal skin, the combination of a straw mattress. Craned health, blood history, and the cap already threaded. That was for waterwork throughout a cold night. Chapter 4, Body Heat. The social architecture of warmth, sleeping together. A survival strategy of all the strategies that medieval peasants is employed to stay warm through winter nights. The effective and the most universally practiced was the simplest. Sleeping together in the medieval peasant household. voice in the modern sense of thermal necessity. Thermal necessity. The combined body heat of 2, 3, 4 people. That is dramatically warmer than any single person could maintain alone. This is basic thermodynamics. The human body produces approximately 80 at rest. And that heat, and it's trapped in an enclosing space effective by several degrees above the ambient temperature. Medieval household records and inventories, as well as literary sources from Chaucer to German folk tales. And folk tales consistently describe sleeping arrangements that modern readers might find intimate to the point of discomfort. Husband and wife in the main bed, children arranged around or beside them, servants or apprentices on pallets near the hearth, parents in the box bed or in the warmest corner. Guests were routinely expected to share beds with strangers. Expectations hospitality rules included instructions on the proper behavior of bed sharing guests, specifying things like keeping to own side of the bed and frame once the other person appeared to be sleeping. The modern assumption that the sleeping space is development. I brought up it in me of Percy. The social dimensions of communal sleep extended beyond the new family. In the longhouse tradition, where the family the other, the proximity animal contributed meaningfully to the thermal and environment of the human sleeping space. A cow produces 600 watts of metabolic heat at rest, roughly equivalent to 7 or 8 and humans, and a small number of cattle in the livestock end of a longhouse could raise the temperature of the entire building by several degrees above would otherwise be achievable from the hearth alone. The smell was significant, and the dampness produced by was erased when was said was the warmth was real and was to be so long who relied upon it. Children and the very old. Then the little sleepers sleep now and the elderly were typically in the warmest available locations as a matter of and social priority. Infants and very young children were in contact their mother, sharing the warmth, the maternal body in the most direct way. Way, the wooden cradle where it was used was killed, and the safe benefiting from the residual warmth of the banked fire. In the coldest weather, the cradle might be brought into the main sleeping space bed between the adults in the bed. The elderly presented a specific challenge in the medieval winter. The aged body loses heat more rapidly than the young adult body, and the chronic conditions that accompany ages, the disease, respiratory disease, cardiovascular weakness, are all exacerbated by cold. The winter death toll among elderly people in medieval relations was made to the summer months and hypothermia. Though recognized as such medieval medicine, which would have described its symptoms as chilling of the humors or weakness of the vital spirit, was certainly contributing factor in many winter deaths. The elderly members of a household are typically given the warmest and most sheltered often in the box bed or nearest the fire, as a particular vulnerability. Chapter 5a, clothing. Portable shoulder with colorful dedicated sleep jamons, pajama, nightgowns, dated sleeping garments, is historically recent and socially specific for most medieval peasants. The sleeping was simply the undergarment worn beneath the day's outer clothing. Olimens for women. A linen shirt, and drawers for men, linen, the primary fabric for medieval and medieval undergarments. Thermal garments in articles and ducts. It conducts heat was right more readily than wool and does not trap air effectively. But is against skin. It can be more easily than wool, and it provides functional layer between the body and the heavier wool outer bedding. In winter, this basic undergarment might be supplemented lays the outer garments laid over the body as additional blankets was a common practice. The sleeping cap, the coif or nightcap, or nightshirts, deserves but that's the most for keeping from the sleeping body. The human head is responsible for a disproportionate fraction of total body. In cold conditions is as 30 to the 30s of the total heat loss occurs through the head, primarily because the scalp has a high density of blood vessels that are close to the surface and poorly insulated by hair and muscle insulation of the torso and limbs. A sleeping cap made early done. Prevalence meaningful. They improve the proves the boot's ability to paint its core temperature through the night. The medieval sleeping cap, documented in manuscripts, in Amporibs, in Hurry, as it and women, stockings worn through big hand another free. It's significant heat loss and are particularly long loss. And to the cold air pooled at floor level. The documented practice of warming the bed before entering it. Using a bed warmer and had filled with hot embers passed between the sheets before sleeping. Sleeping was primarily a practice of the relatively prosperous, since it required a sufficient quantity of embers to the pan without setting. For the poor majority, the equivalent technology, a heated stone wrapped in cloth, plate of the bed before sleep, river stones in the fire, and writer the walls need the hours, and were the equivalent of modern water bottle. Those could not bedroom. Metal bed warmers, the night routine, preparing the body, preparing for sleep deprivation. In a medieval pet household on a wintry, simply of lying down, tired. When tired, it was a managed process of heating and insulation, of getting the body as warm as possible. Before entering the sleeping space, and aid of creating the conditions, pretensions through the night. The evening meal, the warmest parlor above the lake while the cooking woods and it's at its hottest, served per purpose. A purpose, as well as the shelves as a nutritional one. The digestion of a substantial meal generates body heat that raises the temperature for several hours, providing degree natural warming that persisted. Hot drinks consumed in the evening served a similar function. The universal beverage. The universal beverage, medieval England and Northern Europe, and often served warm or mulled in winter. The warmth of a hot drink on the body temperature is both real and relatively prolonged. Herbal infusions, not yet tea in the modern sense. Fairies, including chamomile, mint, and the dried berries and roots of various native plants were consumed for their warmth as much as for any medicinal properties attributed to them. The medieval understanding of warming of Williamson has a bunch standards, but it was observed, grounded in warm eats of hot food and drawn in kind of cold conditions. Chaptics. The livestock, unexpected partners in warmest neighbors in the Weberst, and the most and one that modern readers find simultaneously charming and alarming was the deliberate integration of livestock in the domestic environment. The longhouse, which remained the standard as peasant, and across much of northern and western Europe, designed this invariant. This integration in mind, the shared roof, contiguous space between the human and the animal ends of the building meant that the heat produced by the animals contributed to the warmth of the human living space, while the humans and to the warmth of the animal quarters, the thermal contribution of the livestock with Artilis Bixby 6 watts of metabolic heat and a pig. Perhaps watts. A longhouse with 2 houses and pigs. I've seen to receive like 2,000 from the input. I've come out to well. Electric heater. This heat entered the building through the partition between the spaces through the 2 central the structure and through the similar fact that being that warm air being less dense than cold air, cold air tended to migrate from the warmer livestock toward the human living space. The animals also contributed. With the rapid with the rate of humans and thermally benefit. 3 stirred things and mold. The integration of animals into the domestics was not merely a thermal strategy. It was also an economic one. In the brutal cold of medieval winter, the value of a cow or an ox or a breeding sow was enormous. These represented accumulated years of investment, the foundation of the following year's agricultural productivity. A frost severe enough to kill a family's economic viability at a single stroke, keeping the animals under the same roof as the family was the most. Same roof was serious than a wedlift than the benefit was but inside it was side effects. was a welcome side effect of parasite and electric protection. Hay, straw, and Tradraft. The rounded peasant in winter. Hay and straw, primarily. Hay and straw, primarily. Also chaff, dried bracken, and other plant materials, hazardous. That were exploited with considerable practical sophistication. Straw and hay are excellent insulators. Their cellular terms to wireless thermally equivalents in a wet in equivalent accumulated inting materials and in the quantities in medieval and a medieval wriggles the medieval big something could be used to produce and sell on a significant scale. The practice of packing straw around walls of building or banking eyeballs against the walls LSA. Uploaded eats and does weekends. So some regions puke. I don't realize its application within the sleeping space. The use of dried bracken was a use that underlied had kill it. From the cold floor, the deep litter system in the animal the practice of adding fresh straw rather than waste frequently remotely produced preferably a layer of material on the floor of the animal quarters generated a small but real amount of heat through the microbial activity. This heat, this is modest by any standard. In the other part of a building where every degree mattered, it was not negligible. Chapter Seven. The architecture of winter. How the buildings were signed, waddle, the fix and the physics of warmth, the materials used in medieval peasant construction, were not chosen randomly or merely because they were the cheapest available. They had specific that made them within the medieval technology and economy. Effective at providing shelter from the cold and building the traditions of different regions reflected I'll maximize thermal performance with the materials at hand. Understanding these properties, why people were able to survive winters in structures that, from a modern perspective, wholly inadequate. Thatch, the roof covering made from straw, reeds, or heather, is a surprisingly effective insulator. A thick thatch. Can thermal resistance values compare to a modern insulated roof cavity. The interlocking structure of the thatch traps air within the material and the outer surface outer pressure exposure against wind penetration. The depth of a properly constructed thatch, typically 30 centimeter, provides enough wealth relative our slate covering would permit. The investment well-maintained thatch was therefore economically rational. Saved wattle and daub and technique in which that game plastered I have clay, a mixture of clay, straw and dung. Thermal properties that are less impressive than those of thatch, but better than a naive assessed might suggest. The daub mixture, when dried, provided of thermal mass, the capacity of a material and store heat. So store heat and the wall act that meant the buffer of the heat from the interior during the day, slowly through the night. The thermal mass of a daub wall was modest a stand of stone or brick. But it was not negligible. And in a building, and with a good fire during the day, the warming of the walls by the fire's radiation contributed to this through this slow release mechanism. The sunken floor, the sun ground warmed one of the less obvious persons. In the medieval period was the use of buildings whose floors were set below to the surrounding ground level, so that the lower portions were surrounded by earth rather than exposed to the open air. Earth is an excellent insulator and the temperature a few feet below the surface remains relatively constant throughout the year. Throughout the year, the approximate year, regardless is success. Of subsurface conditions, a building whose walls are banked on the outside. First floor, left, Venice. Spolo Venice from the grounds from bits with grace ground and brown from which the interior temperature can be raised by the hearth. The Viking longhouse and the Grubenhauser. Sunken centered structures found medieval Europe. Different applications of this principle. The Grubenhaus is a semi-subterranean structure around. The floor 1 to 2 feet below the surrounding surface, and the walls builtward for the word of the excavation. These structure common across actually medieval Europe were not large or not elaborate, but their partially underground character. Thermal is less glam from grounds above ground structure. They fell out of use in most regions by the High Middle but the thermal principle exploded. Constant the golden temperature heat surrounds remained relevant throughout the medieval period. Chapter 8 Houd fat out and of the sleeping body eating for winter. The caloric strategy, the human body's capacity to maintain its temperature through functionally mentally a metabolic, the continuous process, the continuous burning of calories to produce the heat that keeps the core temperature from dropping to dangerous levels. This means the quality of the winter diet was directly relative of the quality of night sleep. Paul Felder was a more cold, vulnerable peasant. In ways of poverty, understanding how medievals ate in winter, since how they survived and was worried while winter motivated the same day to the same nutritional coin. The medieval winter diet was for most peasants so less varied and less nutritious than the summer diet. and this nutritional enrichment is resilience. The fresh vegetables and fruits of summer were largely in winter, and were largely unavailable in winter. The preserved foods that replaced them: salted meat, dried fish, stored grain, vegetables kept in the root cellar. Were calorie dense, but typically poor in the vitamins and micronutrients whose absence compromised immune and metabolic efficiency. A peasant entering winter in poor and difficult center. Nu poor national winters. Would take a greater toll. The strategic importance of our diet in clear understood with medieval culture. Without chemical knowledge that would later explain it. Fat provides more than twice the calories per gram of protein or carbohydrate. Provided sustained as heat output over a longer period than the rapid burning of simple carbohydrates, the preserved fat of the autumn slaughter, the lard from the pig, the tallow from the ox, was valued precisely, and the medieval practice the medically dense foods available in the coldest months, and empirically derived understanding of the relationship between food, warmth, the winter brew, iron hot path occupied a supply. In the medieval English diet, the English year throughout the year, in the winter months, had specific thermal dimension. Weak ale, the small ale, but they by men, women, children, cause it was safer than the water. Provided calories, and when served warm, a direct warming effect on the body's core temperature. The alehouse, which exists in even the smallest medieval villages. But provided warmth as well as drink, and its role as a communal winter refuge should not be underestimated. For a peasant whose own dwelling was inadequately, but the alehouse fire, the rally represent the warmest environment available out at the longhouse. Porridge, in its English, potted, pottage, potch, prodded, pride, the medieval peasant throughout the year. It was particularly important in winter for its warming qualities. A bowl of hot pottage. The boats were invested by oil and needs and more unseen of meat fat were available. Consumed in the evening before bed, contributed unto cinema but studies and Lloyd good night. Could not. The act also heated the interior of the dwelling and boosted that at moderate levels. Is to maintain electricity with the temperature interior of a winter interior. The cooking fire of the evening meal was simultaneously household heats. Atmosphere Manager, Boots, Chapter 9. The Little Ice Age, the worst aim, Willowers, Winters, the worst winter the Canberra is than describing banked fires, layered wool bedding, layered sleeping, shall we say, layers sleeping, intercalation, hot food, and drink were generally adequate for surviving the ordinary winter cold, the medieval period. But the ice run around between 100 produced in 16th and 17th centuries. Creates suddenly to their limits and beyond. The historical record of these extreme winters is of us. Of what it did when the news were sufficient. The winter of 1883 to 1884 is 683 to 83 in extraordinary detail by the diarist who described the Thames frozen Boosrims to a depth sufficient to hold an entire frost fair. Coaches, driving and whole oxen being roasted on the ice. The cold that produced this spectacle extended it into the homes of ordinary people with a severity that the villain evidently and a contemporary writer's evidence if froze or ink froze eating this. Ink froze. In glasses, trees split with reports, gunshots from the internal expansion of their frozen sap. In peasant homes, Because the cold that Evelyn experienced in a heated, glazed house would have been dramatically worse in the most extreme cold episodes of the culinary style literature. The least hurting studies were of genuinely members of the community. The death records of French parishes show sharp spikes in mortality during the coldest winters, concentrated in the very young, infants who could maintain and temperature, own body temperature, and who depended entirely on the warmth adults around them. And the very old, whose metabolic reserves and thermoregulatory capacity were insufficient with well-populated with their blue sheep to handle. The historical record makes clear that people of cold died of colds in the worst winters. Thus, not among but among the ordinary working poor whose dwellings could not be warm enough. Community response. Individuals were not enough. The communities of medieval Europe, passive, cold, when individual household strategies were insufficient, community-level responses came into play. The historical documents, several of demons, with enough specificity to give us a picture of how medieval rural communities of the worst winters. The church was the biggest and best built village, and was as diagnosed as Smil Evans killed in the events. The congregation gathering in the church, not only for prayer, but for the shared warmth of mass madness, these mother bodies in an enclosed mutual aid. Central practice, helping neighbors, helping things in need, was the backbone of medieval community life in all seasons, and in winter took sick forms relevant to the cold. Fuel sharing between households, the lending of blankets and coverings to those whose own supplies insufficient. And again, it was already could not safely remain in inadequately heated dwellings. the sharing of cooking fires to reduce the number of separate fires that needed to be maintained. The experience is documentary records, church records, and literary sources. And they represent the community response to the inadequacy of individual sources. This was framed of extreme cold. This chapter, teen, sleep itself. The medieval understanding of winter rest. They slept. The pattern of the medieval night, of how medievalisms stayed warm through winter nights, is not only a question and heating technology. It is also a question about sleep itself. About how medieval understood their sleeping hours, and about how the specific patterns of medieval sleep may have been adapted to the thermal challenges of the winter night in ways to appreciate the research of historians of sleep, particularly Roger work at Days Close. In 2005, has established beyond reasonable doubt that the standard pattern of sleep in pre-industrial Europe was not the single consolidated and 8-hour modern scene promotes, but rather by basic pattern of separate sleep periods. The first sleep began roughly an hour or two after the 4 hours, for 3 to 4 hours. The sleeper then woke naturally, not through disturbance, but as the normal of the first sleep cycle, and remained awake for a period of 2 hours. 1 to 2 hours, 2 to 2 hours, during which they might tend the fire, visit the privy, pray, converse quietly with others who were awake, or simply lie in a contemplative wakefulness that contemporaries described with specific vocabulary. A twilight day, or a sting between sleeping and waking that was considered conducive. And reflection. The second sleep then continued, till dawn. This biphasic sleep pattern is directly relevant. A thermal management. The period of wakefulness between the first and consent. The banked fire. to check that the embers fuel the advs ab the to ensure that fire would still warm at dawn. Still warm at dawn. The specific timing of the wakefulness, roughly in the middle of the night. Night, when the bank evening would be at lowest and the exterior and the at its coldest. Made this nocturnal wakefulness as a file to a watch, to a fire watch, whether the biphasic pattern will respond particulars what from attending or ending. Whether the knock and I are tending was in a sleep that devolved flooded is not the reasons is through the historical evidence, but the convergence is striking. Dreams, prayers, and darks and preparedness experienced was not experienced without interruption of sleep as insomnia. Medieval sources describe it as a time of particular psychology. In which the mind was freed from the demands of daytime activity and deep sleep and deep sleep, and was therefore especially receptive to prayer, meditation, and the kind of reflective thinking that the busy medieval day did not easily accommodate. The medieval church recognized and affirmed the spermed value of this nocturnalness, wakefulness, and monastic offices. The middle of the night prayer, the middle of the night prayer that monks were required to perform was scheduled to coincide with the natural waking period between the two sleeps. In the peasant household, in the nectarholders, so we stood at the party lab. But the little steered that stood and in day and night. In the cold darkness of the winter cottage, a family waking between the first faintness and would find themselves in a space defined by the dim glow of bank flyer. The sound of the breathing of sleeping family members, the noises of the animals, the creak of the frost on the roof, timbers, toward the prayers that medieval sources describe people saying in this form they formed in church, but but in the domestic interior, in the darkness, in company of the sleeping household. With the cold pressing in from outside and the maintaining its small circle of warmth within. Chapter 11. The Warren, Servine, and the return of a peasant whom no one do on a winter morning, to find the fire still burning, if only as a bed of embers that required careful rekindling. The rekindling had survived the night's thermal challenge successfully. The act of kindling the fire with the overnight house was the first of the day. Its success or folly tone. Everything that followed, a fire that had survived the night intact, could be productive cooking in minutes. Had required either the laborious process of striking a new fire from flint and steel. A skill that required dry dirt and practice. But it's false. The socialism of failure that was represented by borrowing embers from a neighbor. The thermal conditions of the medieval winter morning were in some respects the most challenging of the entire day. The entire day, the battalion got its lowest, having through long, cold hours, despite the banked fire's best efforts. The extremities, feet, and hands that had been warmly under the bedding exposure of the room as the sleeper rose and dressed. The first tasks of the day, the animals going to required exposure to the full cold of the winter morning outside. The strategy for managing this transition of the one of the morning was simple, less as possible, of as much as possible to generate body heat, and work as close to the fire as permitted. Children in the medieval household typically stayed in bed or near the fire or longer than cold winter mornings. One was not as a luxury, but as a deliberate strategy for managing the cold. The thermal challenge of a cold winter morning was the least for the least thermal mass and the little capacity to generate their own heat. And the elderly, the household's organization on a cold winter reflected an implicit prioritization of thermal resources toward the most vulnerable, with adults managing the fire and the outdoor tasks while keeping the youngest and oldest members in the warmest available position. Chapter 12. The legacy. What medieval winters taught us wisdom, taught us that in the cold cities, peasants developed over generations for surviving winter nights. Without central heating, he didn't represent a body of practical knowledge about thermodynamics. And human physiology that was both sophisticated empirical foundations in its outcomes. The majority of the people who use these striders, the winters of the Middle Ages, including the middle of the Ice Age, Young Ice Age, and did so generation after generation, accumulating and transmitting the practical knowledge we have been examining in this journey through the medieval. Some of what they knew has been undiscovered. And modern light. The development, the wool blanket, whose insulating property peasants understood, of molecular structure of wool fibers. Trap air, the box bed, whose in space created a microclimate, the surrounding room is the pill. Whose principle of aeration is identical. The biphasic sleep pattern that is being studied is now being studied. Whether the consolidated is natural and universal sleep. Universal as modern sleep hygiene assumes the integration of mass in the buildings. The bind the wall and the wall slow heat release is concept in modern passive house design. Perhaps the most important legacy of the medieval peasants' approach to winter but social. The communal sleeping arrangements, the shared warmth, the mutual aid between neighbors. Yes, and the utility of the household its animals, and its physical environment. These Flanders-Stain survival were in a challenging than an individual achievement. The medieval peasant who survived the wild did so not then isolated and was very into trials, personal health, wellness. But as a member of a household and a community whose collective resources and mutual obligations created a resilience no individual could have achieved alone. The night still speaks, and the coldest speaks on the nights of winter in the villages of medieval Europe. Sadness and Wilson Wade rarely experience. No street lights, no lit willows from houses with houses. No orange glow of a distillats. On the clouds, just the cold and the stars, and inside the cottage, bed of the banked fire, and the breathing of the sleeping families, and the nommals, and the knowledge accumulated through generations of experience and encoded in the practical wisdom of the household of exactly how to manage the night and emerge from it alive. They were not comfortable in the sense word. They were cold much of the time. Cold ways that no amount of adaptation that fully compensated for. In ways killed the weakest among them in the hardest winters. Cold in ways that shaped their bodies, their buildings, their food, their sleep patterns, and their social arrangements in every dimension. But, helpless. The cold was a problem they had solved incompletely, imperfectly, at effort and ingenuity that we can only partially appreciate. But solved well enough to survive, to build families and communities, to raise children and bury the old, to bury the old, plant crops in spring and harvest them in autumn, and to face the next with this combination of preparation, familiarity, communal, practical knowledge that carried them through the last. The medieval peasant sleep under their wool blankets in his bed. So with like the warmth of children beside them, was not a bit cold. Of the cold, they were its masters, modest masters, masters only within the limits that their conditions imposed. The winter night was their domain, and they knew it well. Epilogue. The fire still burns. The fire still burns in northern Sweden. Built in the 8th century on foundations that are much older, where on the coldest winter temperature outside drops to minus as Celsius, and the snow past the window sills. The walls are thick logs, the roof heavy with snow. The Aldo in the main room, a ceramic tiled stove, a stove, the direct descendant of the medieval tile stove. It's been 3 centuries ago and is still in use. It is fired with wood for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, and its thermal mass, the dense ceramic tiles slowly over 12 to 14 hours, keep 13 hours, keeps the room at a comfortable through the night through further fuel. Without any further fuel, the people who sleep in that farmhouse are comfortable. Their medieval predecessors. Others were not, but the principle by which they stay warm, a fire built with knowledge of through the night, a structure designed to retain warmth, bedding layered, for maximum insulation, a family sharing the warmth of a common space. The specific technologies have improved dramatic 8 centuries. Principles. The fire. Insulate the space. Share the warmth. Prepare the body. Have remained constant. They were learned the hard way by the bio who lay down in all the maiden out of the doubt and slowly and at considerable cost will be a learning. We are mourning. We are the inheritors of that knowledge. Every time we pull a blank or odors, cold note of It's about such a picture of the person who discovered through the patient of winter after winter of practical experience as hope is well, until dawn, the fire they banked is still burning. We are warm. We are warm because they were cold, and because they were wise enough and strong enough and enough together enough to do something about it.